Hi everybody and welcome back to a new episode of Diagnosedan. Today we're working on a 2007 BMW 3 Series with a 6-cylinder and 52 engine. Now this car was brought to me by another shop and they have been struggling for months to get this car running right. Now from what they told me, all the trouble started when the DDTSB valve, or the intake adjuster valve, a little plastic valve inside the intake, when that broke, it was sucked into the engine and it damaged some valves. Now they removed the cylinder head, replaced some valves, inspected the head, replaced valve guides, reinstalled the head, but after that they never got it to run right again. They told me that after they reinstalled the cylinder head, this engine never ran right again. It doesn't idle right, it doesn't deliver the power it should, and it sets fault codes. Now, in an attempt to fix this car, they replaced a lot of parts. They replaced the camshaft with a camshaft carrier, and this part alone is close to 1,200 euros new from BMW. They installed new variable timing gears, or Vanos units, which are 400-500 euros each, and they replaced both. Now these are not the only parts they replaced a lot more. They replaced close to 3,000 euros worth in parts, and that's not even included the parts they needed to fix the initial problem. And the thing is, it didn't change a thing. The fault codes are still the same as before, and it has exactly the same symptoms. So hopefully you and me can diagnose this car together. As always, we're going to start out by confirming the customer complaint. Now, one of the complaints is that the engine isn't idling right. Now, that's an easy thing to check, so let's start the engine and find out how it idles. Now, I don't know how well the camera picked that up, but when I started the engine, the entire car was shaking. You could probably hear it by listening to the fluctuations in the engine sound, and you could definitely see it by looking at the tachometer. Now, it doesn't feel like a misfire, it's more like the engine is struggling to keep the RPMs at idle. Now, they also told me that there were fault codes stored, so let's hook up a scan tool and see what we've got. Now let's find out what fault codes we've got. And right now, we've only got one fault code stored, and it's the 2A82. And the fault code description this snap-on unit gives us is Vanos inlet. Now, although we've only got one fault code stored right now, the 2A82 for the Vanos intake, they actually told me that before the car came here, they cleared all the fault codes. But when you drive the car for a little bit longer, it will also flag a code for the Vanos on the exhaust cam. When you work on BMWs, timing or Vanos issues are not that uncommon. The problem is they're not always caused because of the same issue. So just throwing parts at it is not always going to fix the problem. Now, in my online support program, we actually offer tons of information and bulletins on timing and Vanos issues. DDTSB was made for professional workshops and it works very easy. Just select the car you're working on by license plate or VIN number, enter the symptom or the fault code you've got, and if it's something common for the car you're working on, a bulletin will come up which will provide you with all you need to know to fix the issue you are working on. Now, if this doesn't help you, just go to the hotline section and my help desk is ready to support you in any way possible. Now, this way we can truly diagnose a car together. Now, unfortunately, this workshop wasn't subscribed to DDTSB, and if they did, I'm pretty sure we could have prevented them from throwing all these expensive parts at this car without fixing the issue. Now before we continue diagnosing this car, I was thinking, since I've got all these spare parts laying around, maybe this is a nice opportunity to show you guys how the Vanos, or variable cam timing, on this BMW actually works. Now this is the exhaust camshaft in its carrier that has been replaced on this engine. Now at the front of the camshaft we have got the Vanos unit. And the gear on the Vanos unit is normally turned by the timing chain when the engine is running. This engine, the N52 engine, has got a Vanos unit on the exhaust and on the intake. That means that this engine can adjust the timing of both camshafts. Now that immediately brings me to a commonly made mistake. Now although these two units look exactly the same, they're actually not. There's a dedicated unit for the exhaust cam and a dedicated unit for the intake cam. Now the problem is they're interchangeable, so you can easily make a mistake, and believe me, you wouldn't be the first to do that. Now if you give them a good clean, it's actually written on the unit where they should go. In or in for the intake and aus or ex for the exhaust cam. To show you how the Vanos works, I removed these bolts and took the unit apart. Now the Vanos unit is made out of two main parts. An outer part that's connected to the timing chain, and it basically has to go wherever the timing chain is going. And there's an inner part, and the inner part is connected to the camshaft. Now these two parts can rotate within limitations, of course, relative to each other. And that means that when the engine is running, you can actually adjust the cam timing. The Vanos unit works with engine oil pressure supplied by the engine's oil pump. By pushing oil through little bores into this chamber, that chamber will expand and the centerpiece will rotate. When you release the pressure, the whole thing will come back, because on the back of the unit there's a giant spring. When we take it even further apart, we can clearly see the oil passage in the centerpiece, and we can see the spring action. Through bores, the oil ends up at the camshaft. In the camshaft, there are bores that end up at the front of the camshaft, which are connected to holes in the centerpiece of the Vanos unit. Now this leads me to another common failure. When we take a closer look at this camshaft, we can see two metal rings. Now these rings are actually oil seals. Now these seals are known to fail. There's even an updated heavy-duty version. We sometimes also see that these rings start grinding into the surrounding metal to the point they no longer seal, and we start losing oil pressure. When we start losing oil pressure in these bores, we might not have sufficient oil pressure to adjust the Vanos unit. Now of course we need to control the flow of oil to the Vanos units, and that's done by these two solenoids or valves. There's one for the intake camshaft and one for the exhaust camshaft. Now let me quickly remove one for you so I can show you how they work. I removed the solenoid from the car and quickly hooked it up to a battery. Now let's take a close look at that solenoid and let's see what happens when we energize it. Now we can clearly see that these ports open and close when we energize the solenoid. And that brings us to another common failure, and that's that these solenoids can become stuck to the point they no longer control the flow of oil. Now that we've learned a little bit about the Vanos system, we can continue our diagnosis. Now there are many ways we can attack this fault code, but in this video I'll be using an in-cylinder pressure transducer. An in-cylinder pressure transducer allows us to measure the pressures inside the cylinder while the engine is running. Now, I always compare it to seeing an ultrasound for the first time. You think, hey, is that a baby? But when you get experienced at looking at those pictures, you actually can get a whole lot of information from it. In the next step, I'm going to start the engine and we're going to capture that in-cylinder pressure waveform. After that, we're going to analyze it together and hopefully there's a clue in there that can help us diagnose this problem. Now this is the waveform we've just captured, and although this is not an in-cylinder pressure analysis class, I want to quickly take you through the waveform. Now to make this waveform more easy to understand, I already divided it into the 4 strokes and gave them all a different color. We're going to start out with the compression stroke. During the compression stroke, all the valves are closed. So when the piston moves up in the cylinder with the valves closed, the blue trace, the pressure, will rise. Next we have got the power stroke. Now in this waveform, the power stroke isn't exactly a power stroke, because to do this measurement we had to remove the spark plug, and without a spark plug there is no combustion event. Now let's see what happens. The piston goes down again and we see the blue trace, the pressure, decrease again. Next in the waveform we have got the exhaust stroke. During the exhaust stroke, the piston moves up again and pushes all the exhaust gases into the exhaust. Now because the exhaust valves are open, there is a direct connection between the cylinder and the exhaust. So the pressures in the cylinder and the exhaust are exactly the same, and that should be close to atmospheric. And finally, we have got the intake stroke. Now during the intake stroke, the piston moves down again, and because the intake valves have opened, there is now a direct connection between the cylinder and the intake manifold. Now inside the intake manifold there is a vacuum, and that's why we see the pressure drop in the waveform. Now in this specific engine we need to be a little cautious. It's not something I'm going into in this video, but it's something you should know. This engine has got Valvetronic, and once the engine starts running on the Valvetronic system, it loses the vacuum in the intake, and that waveform is gonna look a lot different, but that's specifically for Valvetronic engines. Now the way I just explained this waveform and all the strokes is really oversimplified, because actually there's tons of information and a lot of details we can learn from this waveform. Now I don't want to go into that in this video, but I do want you to take a look at that pressure rise, that hump at the end of the exhaust stroke. Now what we see at the end of the exhaust stroke is that the piston is still moving up, but the exhaust valves are already closing, and that's causing the pressure in the cylinder to rise. That's causing that hump. Now, if the valves close before the end of the exhaust stroke, that means the valves are closing too early. Now, who controls the timing of the valves? Exactly, the Vanos. And that's probably why we have got a Vanos fault code stored. I was just taking a look at a wiring diagram to determine our next test or next step to diagnose this engine, when I discovered something unexpected, unbelievable really. And I've been doing this for a long time, and sometimes when you start a diagnosis, you've got an idea of where this is headed, but this you would never have guessed. And if what I just discovered is going to fix this car, this workshop needs to buy me beer. Lots of it. Heck, they will even need to buy you a beer. I was taking a look at this wiring diagram because I wanted to scope the control wires for the Vanos solenoids. Now both solenoids have got an orange wire, which is the power feed, and the control wire for the exhaust Vanos is the white wire with the red tracer, and for the intake it's a white wire with the blue tracer. Now the white wire with the blue tracer is over here, but the problem is the solenoid for the intake Vanos is the one at the top. It's this one. So it looks like they swapped the connectors around. The in-cylinder pressure transducer is still connected to the engine, so let's quickly swap those connectors around and see if that fixes our Vanos timing issue. Now, as you can see, that waveform really improved. That hump in the exhaust stroke is no longer there. Now let's remove the in-cylinder pressure tester from the cylinder, reinstall the spark plug and ignition coil, and see how this engine idles. So I've got the spark plug and ignition coil reinstalled, so let's fire the engine up and see if we have got a fix. Now, as you could see and probably hear, that really improved the engine's performance. It's now idling stable, and although I still got to drive it, clear the fault codes, considering what we found and looking at the waveforms before and after, I'm pretty sure we've got this one fixed. Now, as you might imagine, oil quality is very important for these engines. So you've got to make sure the engine has got clean oil and you're using the right viscosity. Now, to make sure of that, before I return this one to the customer, I'm gonna do an oil and filter change. Now, while doing that, I wanna point out something to you that also commonly causes a lot of Vanos problems. Now I removed the top of the filter housing and removed the old filter. Now this is a new filter, and this is how this would normally sit in the top of the filter housing over this cage. Now at the centerpiece over here, notice there's a little O-ring, and your new filter always comes with a replacement one. Now I cleaned out the filter housing to show you something you need to be aware of when changing an oil filter on an engine equipped with Vanos. When we take a look at this oil filter housing, we see 3 openings, 1, 2, and a third in the middle. Now the third in the middle is normally blocked off by this centerpiece and this O-ring when the filter is installed correctly. Now how this works is that the unfiltered oil enters the oil filter housing over here, then passes through the filter, and the filtered oil then goes into the engine. Now, where the center hole is for is when you remove the oil filter, it will allow the oil to drain into the oil pan. This is an open and direct connection to the oil pan. Now, under normal circumstances, that hole should be blocked. If it isn't blocked, you'll bleed oil pressure into the oil pan that's needed to adjust the Vanos. Now, I have diagnosed Vanos problems where I found that the cage was missing, or the centerpiece was missing or broken, the seal was broken or missing, so please be aware of this when servicing or diagnosing an engine equipped with Vanos. The last thing I want to tell you in this video, and that causes Vanos issues sometimes, is that in the side of the cylinder head, very close to the chain tensioner, is a non-return valve. Now this non-return valve is screwed in by a T40, and it's basically a one-way valve. Now you should be able to suck on it, but you shouldn't be able to blow on it. Now always make sure this works, and also make sure that the screen or the filter is clean and free of debris. Well, this was definitely one I had never seen before. I know the workshop that brought the car to me very well, and normally they do a very decent job. That proves that a small mistake is easily made. Unfortunately, that small mistake cost a lot of money this time. Now, I really hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please subscribe to my channel, and when you hit the little bell, you will get a notification each time I upload a new video. And remember, Diagnosedan, fixed it again. See you next time, guys. They told me that after they Now to make this waveform more easy to understand, I already